Good evening, everybody. I will be speaking in English because there are also people connected online, and so today's lecture will be in English. It's an honor today to be here and to start the lecture series with this celebration with colleagues and friends that I will introduce you in a minute, but just a few words about why today, on the 27th of September, we are all here. We are celebrating the 200th anniversary of the decipherment of hieroglyphs. 200 years ago, on the 27th of September, 1822, Jean-François Champollion gave a lecture at the Royal Academy of Inscription, a Belles Lettres, in Paris, announcing the discovery that he did a few days before, that he had done a few days before. On the 14th of September, he ran, well, at least the tradition said, he ran to his brother and he said, "Je tiens l'affaire," and then, well, his brother said that he fainted and he actually passed out for almost 5 days, completely worn out of fatigue, of having finally found the key of interpretation of the hieroglyph, of this language that people had long tried to translate, to find the key, and finally we were able to read again, to read the text, to understand the text. Well, what better way to celebrate this here in the museum, in bringing to the attention of you all one of the most important papyrus that we have. And what's a better gift given to the Museo Egizio, having two very nice colleagues, Professor Kim Ryle from the University of Copenhagen and Miriam Krutzsch from the Neues Museum in Berlin, who kindly accepted to be here with us today to talk to you about the work that they did, coordinated by Susanne Toffer, our curator and the one who takes care of our papyrus collection, to the work that they did in the past few years in putting together the fragments, not putting apart, conserving the fragments, recomposing them, decided which fragment should go up and down or left or right, having this nice cooperation between Egyptology and the consideration that Kim was doing about the right chronology, the consideration that Miriam would do about the fibers and how the different fragments should come together. So I leave the floor to them to go into the content of the papyrus that Susanna will briefly give, to then hear from the voice of Kim and Miriam how they worked, both on the reconstruction of the fragments, to understand how, in the light of new discovery, the text could be reconstructed, which fragments belong to the text and which were not, and also to hear how the conservation was done. So I thank you, those of you who are here and those of you who are listening or watching online, and I also would like to remind you that from today onwards, the papyrus is exhibited in a small room in a special exhibition which will be open until the 21st of November. It doesn't mean that from the 21st of November we will conceal to your eyes forever again the papyrus. The papyrus will be exhibited again starting from the 6th of December in a new dedicated area of the museum dedicated to writing. That's the way we want to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the birth of what we call today Egyptology, or what we call today this modern science that takes into account the material culture, the written material culture, the archaeology, the history of ancient Egypt. So from the 6th of December, different documents will tell their story to our public, and we hope from today to start the celebration that will lead to the 200th anniversary of the museum itself in 2024. So I leave the floor to Susanna Toffa, who will give you a brief introduction about the content of the papyrus and why it is so important for us.
Okay, thank you very much, Christian. I think the voice is good. And also, yes, I'm very happy that we are here today with, as Christian said, the director said, Kim Reihold and Miriam Krutzsch. Because in general it's a scientific conference, so both of them, the two of them, will speak mainly. I'm actually, as a curator, the only thing I was doing was, controlling that they're working properly, and they did a very, very good job in doing that. However, as Christian said, I'll give you a brief overview about what we are talking about, what also the exhibition of the papyrus is about. But first, mainly a general thing that you might know, but some of you probably don't know, that the dynasties of pharaohs are divided in groups of kings, united by kingship or by their royal residence. In total, a subdivision into 30 dynasties was adopted in Egyptology based on the written sources by Manetho, a Greek historian and priest who reconstructed the history of ancient Egypt in his study Egyptiaca. So this was in the 3rd century before Christ. To write his work, known to us only thanks to later historians, Manetho consulted ancient Egyptian official documents containing lists of pharaohs. Among the examples of these lists, one of the most important is the Papyrus of Kings, also known as the List of Kings or Canone Regio, which arrived at the Museo Egizio due to a purchase made by the consul Drovetti, Bernardino Drovezi, around 1820-22. I have to say, when I said that Manetho was consulting lists, it is not that he had access to our papyrus, but probably lists which we are copying from sources like our papyrus. So what is the papyrus, or rather the fragments you see here are containing? So actually on the back side, the whole topic, the famous papyrus is written on, the famous text is written on the back side of a papyrus. And it is a chronological list written in hieratic, so the cursive form of the hieroglyphic script, preserving 11 columns of Egyptian rulers. It starts from the primordial mythological period with the divine kingdoms of, for example, gods like Geb, Osiris, Horus, or Seth. So all of them are royal divine gods, deities, up to the end of the second intermediate period, so about 1600 before Christ. The titles, name, and duration of the reign in years, months, and sometimes even in days are recorded for each sovereign. The list of kings mention rulers of great importance such listed. So here we are here about 3000, around 3000 before Christ. But we also have names such as Djoser, one of the pharaohs who erected the first great pyramid in the history. Despite its value for the history of ancient Egypt, the Papyrus of Kings was written on recycled paper. So this is what I mean with it was reused, because the papyrus was first written on the front side, and it was written, the text written on the front side was a text register. And this text register can be dated to the time of Ramses II. So with this we have a certain date. And this text register mentions numerous high officials of the temple of Sobek and Amun, and several superintendents of the head of the fortresses located along the southern border of Egypt. The list of kings was written later, so on the verso. Just to make a small publicizing our website, you find, for example, a very nice interview, not just with the two of them, but also with another scholar who can't be here today, Robert Desmarais, on our website, who's explaining, for example, the text register. So this is why we are not going on more in details on the text register, we are focusing on the king list. What I will also do, and this is something you find also in the exhibition room the director was mentioning, is I give you a brief overview of actually what happened to our papyrus, because when the papyrus came here in our collection, with the collection of Bernardino Drovezi in 1824. It was actually Champollion, and who is the man celebrated today, in general in this year in many cities. Champollion was in general very eager to get the collection of Drovetti to the Louvre, but the Savoia paid more, so this is why we have the collection here. But Champollion arrived here immediately after the collection arrived here, and he stayed for nearly 1 year. And he started to work on fragments, in general on many objects, but also on papyrus fragments containing, as you can see in the facsimile, containing the cartouche, so the introduction of the royal names like Nesut Bede. So this is what he was looking for, probably the royal names. And he was, out of about 300 fragments now, he already sorted out about 47 fragments. So I don't want to, let's say, put down the work of Champollion, but a lot of people connect Champollion with the Royal Canon as being a very big addition. And I hope Kim is agreeing with me that he did a very important and good job. However, he was finding out 47 fragments out of 300. So nevertheless, he started and he gave the base for further research. And the further research was done, for example, by Gustav, I should know how to write my name, Gustav Seifert without an E, a German scholar who was not just something like a conservator, he was also an Egyptologist, and actually he was also working like Champollion on the deciphering of the Egyptian hieroglyphs, but he was less successful. However, also he came to Turin immediately after the collection arrived here, and he was working mainly on papyri. And he was the first actually who did something, well, we wouldn't call it restoration today, but this is what it was considered 200 years ago. He consolidated the fragments, and he found out more fragments on something what we call carta vegetale. So it's a vegetable paper. And this is a condition you see here. This is how he glued the fragments on this paper. And this is what he did, not some only in our collection, also in other collections. So Gustav Seifert, and Kim will talk later more about also what Seifert did with the fragments, found more fragments and consolidated them. Then there was another German scholar, Richard Lapsius, who was already working for other objects in the papyrus collection in Turin and was collaborating with Champollion already before his death. And Lapsius Lapsius was the first who nearly did a complete facsimile of the King List, but following Seifert's arrangement, and he followed also Seifert's numbering of the fragments 1 to 164. Another scholar, normally not really mentioned or not really known to Egyptologists, is John Wilkinson, who is actually important as so far because he was studying and doing a facsimile of the Berso, so the Royal Canon, but he was also doing the first facsimile and study of the taxation text. So let's say Seifert, of course, and also Champollion, they take in consideration the taxation text, but nobody was really interested in the taxation text. So Wilkinson in 1851 was the first who did also the facsimile of the text register. Going back to the restoration, so for many years the papyrus stayed in the condition as Seifert restored it for about 100 years, so on the carta vegetale. But it was in the 1930s when the director at this time of the Museo Egizio, Giulio Farina, decided, because he studied the papyrus, decided to do a restoration of the papyrus because he found more fragments belonging to the papyrus. And he was asking actually another German restorer from Berlin, Hugo Ibscher, to do the restoration. So Hugo Ibscher, he detached the fragments from the carta vegetale, from the registered paper, and he cleaned it as far as I could do it, but I think Kim might talk about this later, also Miriam. Actually, the fragments were glued very hard on the paper, so by cutting out the fragments from the carta vegetale, some of the borders were missing. And this is really interesting because thanks to the facsimiles we have from the scholars before, we know actually what kind of text parts are missing. But again, this will be explained later probably. So Hugo Ibscher did something which was not done before, and he did this in many other collections. He used, instead of this paper, he used silk strips and used silk of Lyon. And what you see here also here, and you saw this actually until the restoration in this year, that there was long bridges between the fragments. So it looked really like, I always called this Frankenstein, because it was really like stitches, medical stitches, but the long bridges in order to fix it. What at this time, and Miriam probably knows this better, was a good thing to do, because the silk is actually okay material. However, over the years, and Miro will talk about this, this caused a lot of tensions on the fragments. After Farina, who studied the papyrus for many years until its publication in 1938, it was Ermina Caudana who was already assisting Hugo Ibscher during the restoration. Caudana fixed or consolidated several more fragments Farina found later during the process. And this must be happened before the restoration and the publication in 1938. So in 1938, this was actually, the first, actually I think you can say the first extensive publication of the Royal Canon with photos and a hieroglyphic transcription based on extensive examination of the papyrus. So Farina, Giulio Farina, actually in 1938 published, and up to today it is really one of the most extensive publications of the Royal Canon. Then there's a second one. It was also studied by a famous English Egyptologist, Alan Gardiner, and he published in 1959 another edition of the papyrus. But he improved, which is important, and Kim will talk about this, he improved Farina's transcription, and he also, and this for the first time, he described the unplaced fragments. Because, and this is what Miriam will talk about this, what you see actually on an exhibition are not all the fragments we have. You can see all the fragments which can be placed, but there are still many fragments which can't be placed because they are because of the missing fiber connection or the missing text connection. So Gardiner was describing the unplaced fragments. And for example, Gardiner's edition, so Gardiner improved Farina's edition, and later on we'll see that Kim actually improved all the editions before. So this is what researchers are doing, is they do the research done by scholars before, and thanks to the new resource, they improve it. Just to mention, there are between Gardiner and also the work done by Kim Reihard, there were other articles, editions, transcriptions, for example, transcription by Kidd in Kitchen, a long volume about Ramesside text. Haig did some things, and I mention here Reihard because Kim already in the end of the 90s, beginning of 2000s, he published several articles. So, and of course, I mean, in the list of scholars, I have to mention him. So, not to embarrass him, so I say Kim Reihard, 1997 to 2022. And I know that his students are now watching, so greetings to Copenhagen. So it is not that he studied for 25 years the manuscript constantly. So he had other things to do, and he was really, really productive in publishing other books. No, what I mean is that in the time of 25 years, he published several articles about chronology in general. He came to Turin in a span of 10 years to see the fragments. So in general, the restoration and the study of a fragmentary manuscript as ours, it takes a lot of time, especially if you are a full professor in Copenhagen. So just to make clear the year, 25 years. So let's say, to put it in the basic, he probably studied maybe 2 or 3 years on it. So it's not 25 years, but still I have to embarrass him a little bit out of friendship. So, no, but to be fair, to be also honest, so he really did a new reconstruction. So what he will explain to you is that it's not just an improvement of what scholars like Gardiner, Farina did before. He reconstructed really new columns. He changed fragments. He took fragments out, which is not a bad thing, because actually together with another colleague, what you can see here who you can see here in the picture is of course Kim Reihard on the left, and you can see Rob Desmarais. as again he studied together with Frederick Hagen, a colleague also from Copenhagen. They studied the tax register. And the both of them in this summer, they studied the papyrus, and they actually found out that some of the fragments do not belong to the Royal Canon, they belong to other papyri from the Medina. And we already found 2 manuscripts which they belong to. So this is actually more, for us, more of importance that they took out fragments which were put there sbagliato, so out of errors. Wrong, thank you. And this is something that Kim did the job mainly virtually. So he was here, he studied the fragments originally, but there was, he did everything on a virtual way based on photos mainly. Then he came here to study together this year in 3 campaigns, together with Miriam Krutzsch, the fibers. And this is important, what Christian already mentioned in the beginning is, it is always Egyptologist, philologist, and the restorer working together. Because Kim is also looking at fibers, and he is doing it in a, of course, very detailed, but in the end, it's the eye of a restorer, especially a restorer like Miriam Krutzsch, who is doing this for more than 46 years, only papyri. And she did the restoration of the more than 300 fragments, and she will explain in detail what she did. And we asked Miriam directly, because the papyrus is not just because it's very famous. Famous is not a reason to use one of the best restorers. It is because it's so fragile. The fibers were so fragile that we really needed a restorer with a lot of experience. And thanks to the collaboration which we had already before, the 2 of them working together for many, many years on other projects. And I was lucky also to work with them together. So we in Turin were lucky that we got them here and in general got the restoration together. So you see here, I mean, I put a picture of myself here, which is something very strange. No, but this is really, so you see the team, but actually I'm not really part, because as I said, I was just really looking out for them. But the 3 of them, Rob, Kim, and especially Miriam and Kim, they did the restoration. And what I really like is that it was a team now in 2022, as it was a team in the 30s by Hugo Ibscher. You see Farina here, right? You see Amina Caudana in the middle, and you see Scamuzzi, the director after Farina, working on looking also on the Royal Canon. So actually, after about 100 years, this kind of international collaboration continued, and you can see the resource now in the room, and you will get all the details now by Miriam, first by Kim and then by Miriam.
Should we switch position, perhaps? I think
You want to sit?
Thank you. As you've heard, this is the bicentennial of the decipherment of the hieroglyphs. And it is an enormous pleasure for me to be able to participate in this, the celebration of Champollion. As you've heard, he was the first to discover the King List, but he also hoped he would be able to publish the King List until the final weeks of his life. We know from letters that it was one of the last things on his mind before his untimely passing. And so I think he would be happy to see us sitting here, or perhaps he is. You've already heard a bit about the King List, but let me just recap shortly. The Turin King List is an Egyptian papyrus inscribed in the hieratic script, and I hope if you haven't already done so, you will all take the opportunity to go and see it in the exhibition. It was originally inscribed with a tax list, as you have heard by Susanne Töpfer, in the reign of King Ramesses II. And probably many of you will be familiar with him because one of the finest sculptures of Ramesses II is sitting in the Gallery of Kings upstairs. Later it was decided to use the papyrus as a kind of scrap paper, and the King List was inscribed on the back. As you might have seen, it is a horribly fragmentary document, and it consists of more than 300 fragments. I'm not sure exactly how many fragments we're up to, but I think Miriam will probably elaborate on that point.
At the moment, 120.
Oh, that are put together.
Yes.
So roughly about 50% of the papyrus is now lost. You've also heard a bit about Bernardino Drovezi already. He was French vice consul to Egypt and later consul general in the early 19th century. At that time, there was a growing interest in Egyptian antiquities, and he decided to invest his relatively limited means in acquiring Egyptian antiquities in the hope that he might be able to sell the collection somewhere in Europe. And his first collection, which was acquired roughly between 1810 and 1820, arrived in Europe in 1820. And it was then sold about a year later to the King of Sardinia, and it became the nucleus, or the beginning, the foundation of what is now the Museo Egizio. Champollion announced his decipherment of the hieroglyphs in 1822. And it was very good timing because this was immediately after the Museo Egizio had been founded. It hadn't even opened officially yet, but the acquisition of this Egyptian collection of antiquities had been announced. And he was very keen to go and study this material. This was perhaps the largest collection of Egyptian antiquities in Europe at the time. And because of his decipherment of the hieroglyphic script and the publicity that generated, he successfully received funding from King Louis XVIII to go to Turin and study this collection, which had not even been catalogued yet. And during the first months in Turin, he managed to identify the first 37 fragments of the King List. He had very high hopes that he would find something of historical interest. At that point in time, we didn't have a good chronology of the Egyptian kings. We did not know very much about the exact order, when they belonged, and so forth. And he knew that inscriptions on monuments were relatively small, but he hoped that the papyri would have longer inscriptions of historical interest. And he was very happy to find in Turin about 170 rolls of papyri. And he opened up most of them, and he was sorely disappointed because most of these rolls contained what he called the ritual, that is the Book of the Dead. And some love the Book of the Dead, some colleagues love to hate it. We have different opinions on that topic. And after having exhausted all of these documents without finding anything of historical interest, to his mind at least, he began working through the smaller fragments, and that is where he found the King List. And this is the first fragment he found, a very small fragment, not much larger than a stamp. And you can see that he has actually labeled the fragment with the letter A on top of it. He did that in the beginning. The first 7 fragments he found, he added a little ink sign to the letter 2, so here letter A. In 1826, Gustav Seyfarth arrived in Turin. Like Champollion, he had been working on the decipherment of the hieroglyphic script. He had very different ideas from Champollion. And like Champollion, he had also heard about this magnificent collection that had been acquired and was now in Turin. He managed to find about 250 new fragments of the papyrus, which is quite an achievement. It is not really known how he managed to find all these fragments because he was not able to read the Egyptian script like Champollion was, so presumably he was doing it visually. It may also be that some of these fragments had been kept together so that they required less sorting. The story he was fond of telling himself is that he sorted through 500,000 fragments and found these 250 fragments. But whether that has any truth to it, whether it is entirely accurate, is difficult to say now. he realized something that was very important, and that was that it might be possible to reconstruct the papyrus, to put it back together partially on the basis of the fibers that form part of the papyrus texture. And Miriam will talk a lot more about how that is done. He had both a lot of success with this and yet again not entirely. Sometimes he managed to join very small pieces together and really did an amazing work at that. But at other times, he got very big fragments wrong. And again, we don't really know much about how he worked. But this is an example of 3 columns. What is marked in green consists of smaller fragments that have been correctly put together, but the red outlines show or indicate that these groups actually belong elsewhere, but as groups they are correct. The yellow fragments are correctly placed according to the fibers, but belong opposite of how they're placed, so the fibers actually do align. And the red fragments are just plainly incorrect. You see another example of that here. But his work was not bad at all for a beginning, especially since no one had ever had that idea before. He was, to my mind, to my knowledge, the first one to reconstruct a papyrus on the basis of the fibers, and I think he deserves credit for that. His interpretation of the papyrus was less successful. Champollion had already seen that it was a king list. Seyfarth went a step further and suggested that this was the original version of Manetho's king list, written by Manetho himself. Manetho is the scholar whom Susanne Töpfer already mentioned. He wrote a history of Egypt in the early 3rd century before Christ, at least according to tradition. In reality, the king list dated from the 13th, or dates to the 13th century BC, so he actually misdated the document by no less than 1,000 years, almost exactly 1,000 years. And this, of course, arose from his inability to actually read the text. Champollion could read it, and the name of Ramesses is preserved on the backside, or the original front of the papyrus. Seyfarth's work, in effect, meant a cessation to Champollion's study of the papyrus because Seyfarth had found so many new fragments. It was simply not practical for Champollion to continue. And also, the 2 men didn't have the best of relationships. For some reason, Gustav Seyfarth was immensely jealous of Champollion. He arrived in Turin, where people generally had a very favorable impression of him, and it really bothered him. We know this because he would write to his mother and father every other week and complain about how much people liked Champollion and how impressed they were with his decipherment. And he tried to persuade everyone that Champollion was a fraud and that his interpretation was the right interpretation, which of course is not correct. He also claimed to be the one who had actually discovered the king list. And he claimed that Champollion was responsible for all the fragments that are now lost, that half of the papyrus is lost. And he did not just claim that Champollion was responsible for this, he really went out of his way to belittle Champollion. So he invented a story already when he was still in Turin that Champollion was unable to read the text. And in frustration, he had actually washed out 2/3 of the papyrus into a toilet. He went out in the toilet, put it in the toilet bowl, and flushed out the papyrus. And this story he would tell to his dying day. In the last years of his life, he wrote his autobiography, and he actually put in that story also. And of course, it is a complete fabrication. It's also a paradox, because if Champollion had not discovered the papyrus, why would he be upset that he couldn't read the king list if he didn't know that it was a king list? It does not make too much sense. Seyfarth never published his reconstruction of the papyrus. This was done in 1842 by Richard Lapsius. Richard Lapsius' edition is a copy of the text, and it is a perfect reproduction of the work that Seyfarth did. He did not attempt at that point to actually translate the document or do more with it. In 1851, there was a new edition of the document. The king list site remained unchanged, but Sir John Gardner Wilkinson also included a facsimile of the tax list. We have already heard this from Susanne. And he added for the first time a preliminary transcription of the King List. That is, he transcribed the hieratic text of the King List into hieroglyphs to facilitate research by colleagues. The first full edition came in 1938 by the hands of Giulio Farina. This was a full edition in the sense that it included photographs of the text. They were very, very small and completely useless, unfortunately. It is not clear to me why such small photographs were published. Perhaps it was too expensive at the time to publish larger photographs. But he did have a full transcription and a full translation of the text and a discussion of the text. And then in 1959, Gardner's edition appeared. It is an edition consisting of a transcription of both the King List and a tax list, and it was a vast improvement on the earlier transcriptions. It has still been possible to improve Gardner's transcription, but only in very minor details. It was an exemplary edition. But no full up-to-date edition has yet been published with high-quality images and full transcriptions, and above all, translations and descriptions of both sides of the papyri. So Susanne mentioned that my own work goes back to 1997, and that is basically true. I was writing a thesis on what we call the second intermediate period in Egypt, a historical period in Egypt. And the Turin King List is one of the most important sources on the chronology of that period, the identity of the kings that ruled at that period. The 90s were a very, very different world when it comes to reconstruction than nowadays. The main tools at the time, I asked Susanne to bring me a magnifying glass. She brought me this little thing here. You probably can't make it out, but it is a magnifying glass. And this is a pair of scissors. These were the main tools. So I studied the papyrus personally, of course, and I looked at the fibers with the light table. But when it came to the virtual reconstruction, I literally had black and white photographs of the quality that photographs had back then, and I would have to cut them out and try to match them. It was very time-consuming. It was agreed back then that I could do a new edition of the papyrus, but back then I thought that what I would be able to do was something like what Gardner had done, a new reconstruction, and then drawings, transcriptions, and translation. I had, at that point, never thought it would be possible to actually have the whole document conserved and reconstructed physically the way you can now see it in the collection. So that is an enormous pleasure to see that. Above all, for my part, the work has been facilitated by digital technology, the fact that we can now make scans at very high resolution that enable us to work with fibers without having to move the fragments physically, which was not possible because of the way the papyrus had been put under glass. How that is done, I have a few slides of that, but Miriam will talk about that, so I will skip those 2 slides. But I will just show some examples of the kind of work that was done. A lot of new fragments were added, small ones, and a lot of fragments were removed. A whole column was added, and another column was removed. This, as you can see in the fragment of papyrus, in the middle there's a piece that is slightly darker in color. This is an example of a very small join. This is the name of King Snofru, the father of Cheops, who built the 2 pyramids you see on the left. And I understand that Miriam has also chosen this fragment for her presentation. We should have coordinated that. So the main results of the present King List project is to provide a new, improved reconstruction of the papyrus, to add a number of newly identified fragments, to remove other fragments, and above all, to rearrange the fragments that are now positively identified in a more correct manner. Now, the conservation has been undertaken by Miriam Krutzsch. There's a new transcription and edition of the King List, for which I'm responsible, and a new transcription and edition of the tax list by my colleagues, Rob de Marie and Frederick Hagen. I would like, at this point, to emphasize the fact that it is entirely due to the director of the museum, Christian Greco, and the curator for the papyrus collection, Susanne Töpfer, that this much larger and much more ambitious project has been possible. They have spared absolutely no effort in providing the necessary means and infrastructure for the project, and has also shown the utmost hospitality during our visits. And also, and above all, it has proved possible to secure the services of none other than Miriam Krutzsch, the famous papyrus restorer in Berlin. I would like also to acknowledge the outstanding work she has done on the text and the enormous amount of time she has invested in this project. So, why is the King List important? Well, it is now known as the Turin Canon, since that was the title of Gardner's edition. But it is not, in fact, a canon. A canon implies a selection process where something is regarded as correct and something is regarded as not correct. So there are kings you include and kings you do not include. The Turin King List is an Egyptian attempt to write a complete king list, that it would include everyone, no matter their reputation. So in contrast to other lists of kings we have from Egypt, the true canons, it includes kings who only ruled parts of the country, half of the country, or even smaller parts of the country. It includes kings that were not natives to Egypt, kings of foreign extraction. It includes kings who had a negative reputation. It includes female rulers. And it includes even the most ephemeral rulers, the most short-lived reigning rulers. And it is the only such document we have in the ancient Egyptian writing. The only other document of its type is Manetho's aforementioned History of Egypt, which is undoubtedly based on an Egyptian original, as Susanne mentioned earlier. An example of an actual canon from the time when the Turin King List is written is the Abydos canon, which exists in two versions. One of them you can still see in Abydos in the great temple of Seti I. And what you see here on the left is King Seti II and his son Ramesses II as crown prince, presenting offerings to the deceased kings. This is the royal ancestor cult. And so they're reading aloud the standard Egyptian offering formula for the benefit of a number of kings who had ruled in Egypt. There is an identical copy of this canon in the temple that Ramesses built once his father had passed away and he had become king. It is now in the British Museum, and you will soon be able to see it in a special exhibition also on the occasion of the Bicentennial of the decipherment of the hieroglyphs. The Abydos canon, in contrast to the Turin King List, omits kings who did not rule entire Egypt. So any king who had not managed to rule all of Egypt, no matter how good or bad, was excluded. It also excludes female rulers, so Neferu-Sobek of the late Middle Kingdom and Hatshepsut of the 18th dynasty are excluded. And it excludes the four kings associated with the so-called Amarna period, so Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Ai, and Tutankhamun. The Turin King List, by contrast, includes everyone, and one of the more interesting examples that I came across myself is this guy who will probably not be known to anyone in the audience, and probably not to many of my colleagues either. His name is Sekepa Enre. He's only known from a single royal signet, which is this scarab you see. His name is preserved in the King List, and according to the King List, he ruled 0 years, 2 months, and then either 1, 2, 3, or 4 days. The figure is damaged. So he had a reign of only 2 months, and he ruled 3,600 years ago. But even he is recorded in the document, and I think this provides a good example of the potential of this document. Had we not had the King List, it would have been very difficult to date this king. The King List is structured as one might expect in a chronological manner. It presumably had a heading originally that is typical of compilation texts, lexical text and such like from Egypt. but the heading is entirely lost. It then has a mythical section, which lists first the gods of Egypt, and there appears to be two versions of that text, because Osiris, Horus, and Seth are both listed twice in that section of the document. And it then proceeds to a list of what we sometimes call demigods, or spirits who ruled Egypt. And it then proceeds to the historical section, which is the main part of the documents. These are the human kings who ruled Egypt, roughly spanning 3100 through 1550 BC. So the king list includes roughly 1,500 years worth of Egyptian kings. And this corresponds to Manetho's first 16 dynasties. We don't know much about the sources for the king list. They're not explicitly mentioned in the document itself, nor would we expect that. But we can see that it is compiled from at least 5 hypothetical sources, and we can see that because the level of detail that is provided about the individual kings vary from section to section. We first have a section where kings are recorded by the length of their reign down to the number of days, and they also note down the age of the king when the king passed away. And that is done only for what is now corresponds to the first and second dynasty. And then for the Old Kingdom, we have years only, and so forth, as you can see in the overhead. This is interesting to us because it reflects the same tradition as we find in Manetho. It is precisely the same kind of dynastic divisions we find here. It is less finely grained, but the divisions are nonetheless the same. And we also see that there are a number of subdivisions. I will not go into them here in the interest of time, but we can see that they break down these divisions even further through headings and summations. As for the sources themselves, we can speculate on what they may have used. Most likely, they used annals. We know the Egyptians compiled annals since the earliest times, and we have annals that do, in fact, record even the reigns of the earliest kings in Egypt, and even record individual events from each single year of the first historical rulers of Egypt. Such annals survive from the Old Kingdom and also a bit from the Middle Kingdom. We don't have any from the New Kingdom that are preserved, but we have references to such annals in the New Kingdom, so they will have existed at that point in time. This is the famous Palermo stone, which preserve annals from the Old Kingdom. The last thing I would talk a little bit about, would like to talk a bit about, is the king list as a historical source. It is a source of indisputable value, but it is not without problem. No sources really are. Some of the immediate problems is, of course, that the king list is so terribly damaged, and even the current reconstruction is imperfect in the sense that there are still a number of very small fragments that remain to be placed. Most of them only preserve numbers, but if the numbers can be connected with a royal name, we may gain an impression of how long that specific king ruled. So there's still potential for a bit more work on the king list. I don't know if you will be back in that case, Miriam, to do a new reconstruction. A further problem is that the original from which the king list was copied was actually damaged. So the papyrus the scribe was copying from was also damaged, not just the papyrus that is here. And this could be the reason why the Turin version of this king list was created, in order to rescue what was preserved of a damaged document. We have other examples of that from ancient Egypt, where scribes have available damaged texts, and they then copy them in order to rescue what remains, but they sometimes indicate lacuna. And I will just give a couple of examples of this. In the Ibscher's king list, the whole, what we call late Old Kingdom, is recorded. And so we have the names of King Pepi II and 2 more kings, and then a further number of names, and yet some more kings. If we turn to the Turin King List, we see that 10 names are entirely omitted. And the 2 kings who follow this lacuna, their names are both incompletely preserved. So it is clear that there was a hole in the original papyrus at this point. Almost half a page of the papyrus must have been damaged. And this was actually noted down by the scribe of the King List, he wrote that there was a hole in the papyrus, a lacuna in the papyrus. So in this case, it was a very substantial hole. Elsewhere, they were smaller holes, like some of the so-called wormholes or insect holes we sometimes find in papyri. And these are two examples. One is a king called Ibscher, where the number of months he ruled is lost. So the scribe is indicating that a single figure is lost. So the king ruled a number of years, the number of months is lost, and then a number of days. And another example, Zeus Enre, we have again the years, and then a hole and a number of days. And by sort of the irony of fate, there are now modern lacunae next to the indications of these lacunae that were there more than 3,000 years ago. So there's holes upon holes. There were holes in the old list, and now we have holes next to those holes in the new list. Another question that the historian always has to ask when faced with the potential sources: what is the background of the source, how accurate it is, what is its limitations? Well, we know the Turin King List was based on a variety of unknown sources. I've mentioned that already. We can see that a number of the royal names are garbled or are incomplete. They're names that they did no longer understand. We can see that the scribe was unaware that some of these many kings actually ruled at the same time, but in different parts of Egypt. So he presents the kings as if it was one long sequence, but in real life or in real history, some of them ruled simultaneously in different parts of Egypt. There are also a few kings that are misplaced, and sometimes the reign lengths are incorrectly recorded. One of the challenges in trying to assess the historical importance of the document is the fact that it lacks an archaeological and social context. We do not know much about where it was found. We do not know exactly when it was found either. The most frequently cited account of its discovery is this one provided by an American colleague in 1947, so 130 years after the papyrus was found, a long time afterwards. He states that when the papyrus was found by Drovetti in 1823 or 1824, it was apparently complete, and he put it into a jar which he tied around his waist, so by his belt. And then he got onto his donkey and he rode into town, and the papyrus was simply shaken to pieces in that jar. And so when he opened the jar again, the papyrus had been reduced to small scraps and dust. This story has absolutely nothing to it. It has no truth to it, although it has been cited often. First of all, the papyrus arrived in Europe already in 1820, so the dates are clearly wrong. And he has no sources for this story. We don't even know whether Drovetti himself actually found the papyrus. Perhaps more importantly, the oldest source to mention the discovery of the papyrus claims to know that it was found inside a jar, not put in a jar by Drovetti, but actually found inside a jar. That is actually significant because we now know that it was very common to store papyri in jars. But when this account was written, that was not known, so it is very likely that there is some truth to that. If that is the case, it is very likely that the papyrus was in fact intact when it was found, but exactly how it fell apart, we do not know. We also cannot assign an exact date of discovery. It is known or believed that Drovetti began collecting antiquities around 1810, and it arrived in Europe in 1820, so sometime within that 10-year interval. It is very likely that the papyrus comes from Thebes, the site where you have the Valley of the Kings and Karnak and Luxor and so forth. Some of the fragments of the King List were found among papyri from Deir el-Medina, a lot of which are exhibited in the collection, like the gold mine map and the architectural plan of the tomb of Ramesses IV and so on. And it is possible that the Turin King List was in fact written at Deir el-Medina, but it has We have yet to think about this, because it is possible that those fragments were later mixed with fragments from Del Medina. That sometimes happened, that papyrus fragments from different sites were mixed. And I would like to end with a final reflection in discussing this list, King List, and it's important. Now, Champollion had a lot of good luck. He arrived in Turin hoping to find an important historical document on papyrus, and within 3 months he had found one of the most important documents on papyrus ever to be discovered. That is unfortunately not how papyrology is most of the time, but the Turin King List was a unique document when Champollion discovered it in early November of 1824, and it remains a unique document now 198 years later. In the 2 centuries that has passed since Champollion's discovery, despite thousands of scholarly years being invested in the study of papyri, nothing comparable has ever been found again. So with these words, I thank you for your attention.
I'm very happy and thankful that I was allowed to do this work. The conservation work started with a condition survey to see the exact condition and the state of preservation. What I do is that I distinguish 2 things. I distinguish between the material structure and the state of preservation. The King List was written on a very, very high quality papyrus material. It was written with a brush, with carbon ink and a little bit red ink. It's not clear if it is Meinige or Zinnober. But what we can see, the material structure, here in a sample by a small fragment, we have a very thin and very flexible papyrus. And the papyrus is so thin, I've measured the thickness between 0.11 and 0.18 millimeter. And normally is, by the pharaonic papyri, that the papyrus material is transparent. This papyrus is not only transparent, it is translucent. And what we can see, that we see the writing on the other side without transmitting light. And here, by this fragment, you can see a little bit the writing on the other side in the line 3. The other point is to see the material structure by transmitted light. And what we can see, very fine fibers in not tiny structure, and we see the very even papyrus structure in both directions, in recto and verso. The other is the state of preservation. You know this papyrus, and we have heard it now today also, we have a lot of fragments. At the moment we have 120 fragments in this papyrus. But we start with a little bit more fragments. And all these fragments, or a lot of fragments, are islands. And they was glued and fixed and with a connection with silk textile strips. You know it from the historical exhibition, and what we see before this conservation, a lot of bridges and strips. Before I started with the conservation work, I had done a drawing, and I give in this drawing all strips. And the strips was on both sides. And here you can see red and green parts, red for the verso side and green for the recto side. The strips, the main strips, was textile. We have also a little bit strips from paper and plastic. And these textile strips was a big problem. This textile was too strong for the papyrus. The papyrus is very thin. The textile is also not so thick, but very strong in the condition. And it has also a gummed, was a gummed material. It was gummed with a protein glue. And protein glue will be over the years hardens and broken and brittle. And so it becomes a very high density between the material and the historical strips. And so it was clear that I must remove them. Here is one small fragment as a sample, and you can see strips on one side and on the other side also. And what we can see on the left-hand side, 5 strips directly together. And also one strip on the left image, on the left edge, is directly on the edge. And it was very difficult to remove them, a strip from the edge of a fragment. And the other thing is that the strips goes over the ink, over the writing, and the density between these strips and the papyrus was that the papyrus becomes a lot of hair cracks. Then I started with the preservation work. Here you can see one fragment is a shape of a little dog, and from both sides. And I started with a drawing, and I give all strips in this drawing, and you see a lot of strips directly in the connection. What I have done, I have removed the strips all over at the first, dry with scalpel and tweezer. If it goes not dry, then I worked with human enzymes. We know it is spoke. And so I can remove the strips step by step, and the fragments. One fragment was then more than one, a lot of smaller fragments, and you can see the tapes, the strips, they have removed in the upper part. And after this step, I fixed the loose parts, and now we have a complete fragment here all over in the transmitted light. And after conservation of this part, we have a very good condition by this papyrus. Before I prepared all fragments, step by step, I remove the fragments from the glass. And here you can see the long strips, the bridges, and also all small strips. And on this papyrus, on all these fragments, were around 2,000 strips on both sides. And this was the main work in all these 10 weeks that I worked on this papyrus. This goes over around 3.5 weeks. It was very hard to remove them. After removing the strips and after fixing all loose parts, I started with the reconstruction, and for this reconstruction was helpful the work from Kim, and also to check if it is correct what he read. And very helpful are by the reconstruction of fragments, the material structure, the fibers on recto and verso, then the sheet measurement and sheet joints. We have a lot of different sheet joints. We have 8 single papyrus sheets in this roll and 7 sheet joints, but 1 is lost. And also we have patches. They were ancient repairs. Before the King List was written, the papyrus roll was repaired with these patches, and these patches are over the roll, all over in a similar part, and this was very helpful for the reconstruction position of the fragments. For the reconstruction, we have also a lot of new fragments, around or over 100 fragments, and 15 of them Kim had found for 15 fragments the origin positions. And here you can see one of them sits on one edge, and another is in a missing part now. The last step of the conservation work is the mounting and framing of all these fragments. What I have done is I become an image from Kim with the origin positions of all fragments, and after checking all positions, I give this picture in 1:1 under the bottom glass, and on the bottom glass, on the top of the bottom glass, I give a Japanese paper, and this Japanese paper is only 1.6 gram thick. It's very thin, and so you can see all over the writing on the other side. And this Japanese paper I glued on all 4 edges with cellulose, Toulouse MH 1000, and this Japanese paper has not a flattened surface, and so the papyrus, here you can see the cross-section over the papyrus, the line is recto, and the other line is bottom line is the verso. Take off only on this papyrus without glue together. And all comes in a second glass in the upper part, all were framed, and here you can see the column 11, the upper part of this column on the Japanese paper. You see it is very thin, and the papyrus fragments take off only on the Japanese, and I let the corners open for air circulation. Here you can see it. Yeah, And now we have only 2 frames. Before all fragments were in 3 frames. Now we have 2, and you can see it in the special exhibition room. And I think now we can see the papyrus by itself, and not more with strips and other things. Yeah, these are my materials and tools, you know, scalpel, tweezers, various brushes, color shaper, and glue. And I work also with Japanese paper, tengu, for small strips with 7.3 gram or 1.6 for the mounting, and magnifying lamp and other things, you know. And this was all, and I say many thanks for.
This one is not working. So you see that today we are celebrating history, but actually what Miriam did and Kim did is history in itself. Kim already mentioned that we have to thank Rob de Marais, who could not be here today, but it was extremely helpful. But have you seen what Miriam managed to do? Have you seen all those stripes? Those of you who remember the papyrus, remember actually being distracted, as Miriam said, on seeing all these stripes and almost forgetting the fragments themselves. Now when you will see them upstairs in this new frame, in this new Japanese paper, and think also that now nothing is used. There is no glue, there are no stripes, so the papyrus is actually floating in this very thin Japanese paper. Miriam said it will stay for now, so we are kind of happy. It's really only also on your bare eye you see the achievement, and my heartfelt thanks to Miriam will never be enough, because she did an amazing job. Thanks to Kim, those 25 years were worth spending, even though you did also some other stuff. And this unique, papyrus, as you heard, and the importance of it, is now also on display for all of you for 2 months until the 21st of November. It will be on display again, and I invite you all to come back on the 6th of December when we will open. And thanks again for our guests tonight, and also for their amazing work, but also for reacting immediately when we said we would like to celebrate this day. Kim just arrived a few hours ago. He has to catch a flight tomorrow morning at 6, I believe, and leave the hotel at 4, but he wanted to be here. Miriam wanted to be here, and thanks again for what you've done. And in the future, we can be sure that when we will celebrate the 300th anniversary, among the list of people to be remembered, for sure there will both your names. So thank you so much. If there is any curiosity or questions, both here in the room or for those who are following us in streaming, I'm sure that Kim and Miriam are here to answer. Yes?
May I ask, in what condition was arrived here to the Papyrus from the beginning? And being destroyed completely here, but was in this condition also when already found?
Well, the papyrus, when it arrived, looked like many other papyri when they arrive in collections. Often they are found more or less intact but when they're removed by non-archaeologists, which many things were back in those days, they break easily. It's a little bit like dry leaves in the autumn. They become brittle. So the papyrus consisted of a lot of fragments of perhaps this size. And the same is true for many of the other papyri in the collection. In Berlin and Copenhagen, we also have big collections of papyri. So it is a quite usual state of preservation. So a lot of our time is invested in putting papyri together. So I do it virtually, and Miriam is the one who does it physically. It's whenever we publish a papyrus, unless it is a nice roll of the Book of the Dead, usually half of the time we use is spent just trying to put pieces together. Or we leave it to Miriam. Yes, thank you. Scusi. Yes. The microphone is not on.
Grazie. Avete detto che sono stati trovati dei frammenti nuovi, che sono stati immessi dei nuovi frammenti. Dove erano questi frammenti? Vorrei sapere, in questo caso mi può rispondere la dottoressa Toffner, come sono conservati i pezzettini che devono essere posizionati in determinati papiri? Cioè i nuovi frammenti da dove provenivano? Ci sono delle teche particolari che contengono frammenti del papiro regio, eccetera, o come vengono conservati e come vengono trovati? Grazie.
No, actually, so the papyri came here. So it is not that it's, let's say, the papyri were not separated like you had one box for this papyrus, another box for one papyrus. Actually, it's like you had 500 puzzles and 20,000 pieces of puzzles together. So this is what the situation was. So it was actually a big puzzle. So this is why when Champollion was searching through the puzzle box, he was finding just some of them. But actually also what he did, he was already sorting out other fragments with king lists. So the condition, for example, as Kim was pointing out, Kim was finding more fragments, as Farina later, as Seifert before, etc., because they went through the same boxes many times and took out the situation. So until, let's say, the 70s, the 50s, it was really big kind of boxes of pieces of papyrus fragments. Coming all from Del Medina. I mean, when you go through the Del Medina room, all the Del Medina papyri, mainly all of them, which are not Book of the Dead papyri, are fragmentary. Look at the Papiro delle Miniere, Papiro delle Tombe di Quattro, Ramesses IV. All of them are actually fragmentary papyri. So they were put together. So this was the situation before. But this is something, of course, which we are changing now. So Kim did the same as was doing Rob de Marais 30 years before Kim, going through and through again boxes or folders of fragments and sorting out. So actually what they are doing is they're using their eye for the hands. So this is how we work today, is you have an eye for handwriting. So it's not just the content, but it's really the paleography. So at a certain point, because, and this is what I said so I was not kidding, it is, when I said 20 years, is constantly you come every year, every 2 years, you always find, you go through the same material, but you always find something new because you have a fresh look on the handwriting. So, so this was the situation before. This is the situation nearly, we have still some of those kind of boxes because the material is too fragile, but for example now the fragments are better separated. And but Kim wants to say something.
I just wanted to add two small remarks. The new fragments that I worked on, I did not in fact find those myself. They were brought to my attention by Rob de Marais, and he had found them already put together by someone else, and we don't, in fact, know who sorted them out. So someone had sorted them out. Possibly they were sorted out already by Seyfarth. We simply do not know for sure. But what happened sometimes with some of these broken papyri is that someone would find a papyrus and they know that it has a value, it can be sold. And if two people find it, they will divide it in two parts. You take a part, I take a part. And then one person sells to this antiquities dealer and another one sells to that antiquities dealer. And so sometimes we find fragments in other collections. This happens also in Turin. And I had example just a few years ago. I was working on a papyrus in Berlin, and I found another fragment in Reykjavik, in Iceland, of all places, Iceland. And it was a pure coincidence. Someone told me there was a papyrus. I looked at it and I recognized it, and I saw that it was the same. And that papyrus was also sold in the 19th century, like the King List. So it is not entirely impossible that more parts may come to light. But since the papyrus is so famous, anyone would notice it if a scholar looked at it. But there could be collections, there still are collections that come to light with papyri that no one has seen for 100, 200 years. So perhaps once our publication is out, someone will find the rest, and then we can begin all over.
Volevo chiedere una semplice, allora, è possibile considerare questo papiro a livello storico più importante esistente attualmente, anche perché si parla all'inizio, nelle prime colonne, di re mitici che sono dei, Set, Osiride, eccetera, eccetera. C'è questa possibilità di dare questa importanza capitale a questo papiro?
Well, I think Christian could try to contact UNESCO and argue that fact and had it added to the list. But in some sense, yes. But of course, different scholars have different interests. Someone else would say that the gold mine map, as one of the oldest known maps, is the most important of its kind, or some religious texts. So it really depends on your interests. But from a purely historical point of view, certainly it has far more information than most other documents. So, yes.
I like your answer anyway, because we're both in Turin, so either of them I wouldn't mind.
Thank you.
Grazie a voi per questa vostra illuminazione. Una domanda da una persona non competente ai lavori. Con tutto ciò che gira di falso, voi come riuscite, sicuramente avete i vostri metodi, però per noi comuni mortali, ovviamente, c'è un metodo, un qualcosa che voi riuscite a capire il materiale vero da quello, a distinguere il materiale vero da quello falso? Grazie.
No, it is a very valid question. If you're interested in this, I would suggest that you look in Google, on the internet, for the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, which is a very good example of a fake papyrus that made very big news, both first in academia, because the papyrus apparently mentioned the wife of Jesus Christ, and then later it was discovered that it was in fact a fake. But what the forger had done in that case was that he had used genuine papyrus. Most collections, big papyrus collections, will have small blank bits of papyrus. We all have such. And they had then written on a genuine papyrus, but the writing was modern. But that text was written in the Coptic script, which is perhaps slightly easier to falsify than the ancient hieratic or demotic scripts.
In addition, I have analyzed this papyrus, but it was only possible from a picture. But I have see on this picture a sheet join, and what I can say, I have analyzed the sheet joins, and I have found a red line by the wideness of the sheet join. And this sheet join on this special papyrus, Jesus' wife, is too wide for the time what it was. And so it cannot, it must be a fake.
Thank you.
If there are no more questions, then I thank you, Miriam, again, and Kim, and thank you also for being here tonight. I thank you, Susanna, who coordinated the project, and you all for listening to this lecture, and I really invite you to go to the galleries and to see the preserved papyrus in its glorious state today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.